This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only. Check out our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, at youtube.com/UCTV Prime. Subscribe today to get new programs every week.
Elyn Saks is both a tenured law professor at the University of Southern California and the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Award. She is also the graduate of the Yale Law School. She studied philosophy as a Marshall Scholar at Oxford University. And back in 1977, when she got her BA degree from Vanderbilt, she graduated #1 in her class. Elyn Saks is an expert in mental health law and has written at length about the legal rights of the mentally ill. But she is not simply an expert. She is also someone who has struggled herself with serious mental illness. She knows firsthand what it's like to live with terrifying delusions, to be hospitalized against your will, and to be strapped down to a hospital bed and immobilized for hours on end. She described all of this in her 2007 memoir, which Time magazine recognized as one of the 10 best nonfiction books of that year. Her book was called The Center Cannot Hold: My Journey Through Madness. Elyn Saks, welcome to our Legally Speaking series.
Wonderful to be here, Marty. Thank you.
When you were diagnosed with chronic paranoid schizophrenia, you were what, in your late 20s, early 30s?
You know, I had broken down in my early 20s, but I got that diagnosis sort of mid-20s.
And your prognosis was described as grim, which meant, I think...
Well, I had two different ones. One was very poor and one was grave.
Oh,
and what that means is that...
grave. Yeah, okay.
Grim is a little bit grimmer than grave.
Yeah.
That I would not be able to live independently, let alone to work. So that was sort of
let
what was
alone
predicted.
have a career as an eminent scholar.
And good friends and a husband and a great life.
So how do you explain how you were able to, in such a spectacular fashion, defy the conventional wisdom?
Well, I don't think I was sort of a lone woman who, through sheer strength of will, overcame odds. I had a lot of resources invested in my care. So I had 5-day-a-week psychoanalytic psychotherapy for decades and continuing. And I had excellent psychopharmacology. In the beginning, I resisted the meds. Now I accept them, and my life is much better. Wonderful family and friends, very supportive, very kind, very helpful. A wonderful work environment. I just love going to work every day. In fact, I go in 7 days a week because reading and writing is one of my most favorite things, and that helps stabilize me. So all those things together, you know, let me have a better life than I was expected to have. In fact, my little brother used to say, even when I was a teenager, I was the most stubborn person he ever met, and maybe I was just an example of my stubbornness. If you say I can't work, I'll show you.
So is it fair to describe you as an outlier when it comes to the illness that you had?
Probably. I don't really know what the stats are on how many people are high functioning with my diagnosis. A lot of people say I'm unique. I'm not. I'm engaged in 2 studies, one at USC and UCLA and one at USC and UCSD, involving other, quote, high functioning people with schizophrenia. And our LA project has 2 MDs, a PhD clinical psychologist, a JD, teachers, full-time students, full-time parents. There are other people out there. It's just the stigma so great that they don't come out. I have a great platform because I have a tenured position at a law school, so my job's not endangered. And for some people, it may be more of a risk to come out.
When you, before you published your memoir, very, very few people knew that you suffered from a mental illness. And it's understandable that you would not tell a lot of people because there is this huge stigma attached to mental illness. So how do you, what convinced you after so long not to tell anybody, to, in essence, tell the world?
You know, I just thought about it over many, many years, and my best friend Steve would talk about it with me and encourage me to do it. And I just, at some point, I thought, this could help people. This could make a difference in some people's lives. It could give people hope. I really should do this. One of my friends, an emeritus professor of psychiatry at UCLA, said I should do it under a pseudonym. And I said, that would send the wrong idea that this is just too awful to say out loud. Part of the point is to put a human face on schizophrenia, on mental illness, and to do it as myself and to own it and not hide from it or be ashamed.
Is it fair to say that you wouldn't have done it without having gotten tenure first?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I think probably if there were no such institution as a tenure and I were in my 17th year here at USC, it's a great place. It's very nurturing. It's very stimulating and caring.
Yeah.
So I probably would have done it anyway, I think, here, but it would have been a bigger risk.
You wrote a book a few years before your memoir in which you observed that there was this huge stigma attached to mental illness. And you said in that book that one of the reasons there's a huge stigma is because people who are highly functional, who have these illnesses, do not come forward. So when you wrote that, were you feeling at all guilty that you hadn't come forward yourself
Probably
yet?
A little bit, probably. I mean, the stigma is really horrific. I mean, as an example, one of my colleagues said after the Jared Loughner case, if he had been bleeding copiously from the nose, his parents would have taken him to the ER whether he wanted to go or not. There were a lot of red flags. Either they didn't see it, didn't know how to understand it, or were afraid of the stigma. But the consequence was disastrous. I mean, people, even quite apart from people actually harming other people who don't get care suffer, and they don't need to suffer. It's an illness. There is treatment available. So stigma is a real bad thing.
You were, 7, 8 years old when you got your first hint that you may have a mental illness, or that something was different about you.
Well, I don't think I would have been diagnosed as a childhood person with schizophrenia, but I had phobias, I had obsessions, I had night terrors. I had as you said, when I was 7 or 8, I had my first period of disorganization.
It sounds like you had kind of like an existential meltdown.
In a way.
Let me read what you wrote in your memoir. Most people know what it's like to be seriously afraid, and this was after, I guess, your father snapped at you for some reason, then you had this reaction. And you say, but explaining what I've come to call disorganization is a different challenge altogether. Consciousness gradually loses its coherence. One center gives way. The me becomes a haze, and the solid center from which one experiences reality breaks up like a bad radio signal. Now, as you got older and your delusions became more elaborate, did this lack of centeredness that you described remain a constant?
Oh, sure. I mean, I call it, and it's called disorganization. There's a form of schizophrenia. There's paranoid schizophrenia, which I also have a touch of, and disorganized schizophrenia. And that's what I described as what disorganization feels like. It feels like your mind is a sandcastle with all the sand sliding away in the receding surf and no center to take things in and make sense of them. And that's why I called Following Yates, my book, The Center Cannot Hold, to kind of convey that experience.
You studied philosophy at Oxford, so I think it's fair to ask you one grand philosophical question, and that is, having experienced mental illness, do you think that gives you any unique insights into the nature of free will? Is it real? Is it a biochemical illusion, or something in between?
It's a really, really hard question. I think there's a lot of evidence that a lot of what we do is psychically determined, but we also feel like we have free will. In a sense, my coming to accept that there were certain things that were wrong with me that were out of my control was a hard battle to win. And in a way, that's saying I'm not responsible for it. It's something that befell me or happened to me. At the same time, I also feel like I've made a lot of effort to have a good life, and that, surely that those choices were mine and good choices to make kind of thing. So it's a real tough question.
I think your memoir kind of conveys a mixed message on this. On the one hand, you just alluded a little while ago to your stubbornness, and that suggests, free will kind of, take on how you were able to get through what you got through. But on the other hand, you also talk about your struggles with trying to do without antipsychotic medications. And in the end, you realized you couldn't do without those drugs, which suggests that, you were kind of enslaved by your biochemistry to the point where you needed
It's sort of interesting.
A drug.
Because it's sort of interesting because here's an example of, I used to think that I'm not mentally ill for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons was that I was choosing to believe what I believed and so on. And then I realized there was a time when I was on a drug called Navain, and a friend was on Navain in a support group, and she was complaining about how she was tapping her toes all the time. And I knew I was tapping my toes all the time, and she was on Navain, and I knew I was tapping my toes all the time, but I was just doing it. I wanted to do it. I did it. I could stop whenever I wanted to. I'd start again very quickly, but it was my choice. And then I switched drugs, and my toe tapping stopped. So you can kind of claim responsibility for something that's not really in your control.
Well, you do explicitly you raise the question in your memoir whether the brain is the same thing as the mind.
Right.
And you write, I had been taught all my life that intelligence combined with discipline could overcome any challenge, and mostly that belief had served me well. The problem was it assumed that the intelligence at hand was fully functional, fully capable, but I'd been told by experts that my brain had serious problems. Could I hang on to one while conceding that there was a big flaw in the other? So how do you exactly sort that out? How do you retain a sense of self that's distinct from an illness that is in a profound way affecting not only how you view the world, but also, it seems, your personality? How do you keep those things distinct?
Difficult. It's difficult. You know, it's sort of interesting because I struggled against having the diagnosis for such a long time. And the ironic thing is once that I accepted that I had the illness and I needed medication and therapy, it really came to define me much less. So it became sort of accident rather than essence. So I now think of myself as a person. Yes, I have schizophrenia. Yes, it affects my life. But I'm much more than the diagnosis. It took me a long time to get there.
So talk a little bit more about that. How are you able to get to that point?
I think, you know, one thing was that when I struggled about medication for a long time, and when I finally got on a stable dose, it occurred to me that I had always thought that people had the same chaotic and violent and scary thoughts that I did. They were just better at hiding it. So I was like socially maladroit rather than ill. And when I got on the new medication and stayed on it, and it cleared my mind a lot, I realized that wasn't true.
How do you know it's not true?
How do I know it's not true? Well, you don't know. Ultimately, you don't really know what's in another person's mind.
You were diagnosed at one point by was a psychologist named Anthony Storr.
Dr. Storr, yeah.
And very eminent psychologist, written a number of books.
I think a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst.
Is he a psychiatrist?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, he wrote at one point in one of his books, he said, the dividing lines between sanity and mental illness have been drawn in the wrong place. The sane are madder than we think, the mad saner.
That's a great line.
Yeah.
I buy that.
Yeah, you do?
I do.
Okay,
yeah.
so...
I do.
But you also buy into the idea now that it's not just that you were lacking diplomatic skills.
Right. Well, it's sort of not uncommon for people to think other people think the same way that they do.
Right.
Right. You know, like I think people who say they like to exercise are just telling lies or fooling themselves or whatever. Well, but that's the point. We assume that people feel, and a lot of times they don't.
Yeah, yeah. You know, as you describe the sorts of delusions that you had in your memoir, it does seem to me that there's a paradoxical quality to them. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, there is the sense that you had of omnipotence.
Right.
That you actually imagined in the throes of your delusions that you could kill people with your mind.
Right.
And in fact, in the throes of some of your delusions, you actually thought that you had killed people.
Killed hundreds of thousands of people with my thoughts.
But then on the other hand, you also had a sense of profound vulnerability.
Yes.
That people were trying to kill you.
Right.
Is this a typical pattern for people experiencing these sorts of episodes?
I think that's pretty common. People are both afraid of their own violence and afraid of other people's violence. It's pretty common.
It was during your...
If I can interrupt for 1 second, speaking about feeling kind of grandiose, My husband read a little bit when I showed him my memoir. There was a passage where I was having delusions, and I said, "I'm God, or I used to be." And he wrote a marginal note: "Did you quit, or were you fired?" And then he said, "Who would have the authority to fire God?" So that was kind of funny.
There's another quote that I had read. An eminent psychiatrist or psychologist, I don't remember which, quoted one of his patients who said, "You know, in my world, I'm omnipotent. In your world, I have to practice diplomacy."
That's a great line.
And you kind of felt that way, didn't you?
I did, actually. I mean, one of the things that served me well having a very serious illness is even if I didn't have insight that it was an illness completely, I always knew what other people would think was crazy. And I didn't want to appear crazy, so either I wouldn't say it, or if I couldn't not say it, I just stayed home. So that kind of social judgment served me well in terms of making myself through a professional world.
Were you able, in the throes of a delusion, to do what's called double bookkeeping? You know what I mean by that?
Yeah. I think not all the time, but sometimes. Not all the time. I mean, at my worst, I would just be kind of sitting in bed listening to music and holding my head, afraid that it was going to explode. But I could be pretty symptomatic and still work. I mean, work has been an important part of my, the package that keeps me sane and stable.
It was during your first year at Yale Law School, I believe,
correct,
that you experienced the breakdown that led to the forced hospitalization in which you were forcibly restrained.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could talk about that experience. It sounded like it was a terrifying experience for you.
It was devastating. Being in restraints over 10 hours is extremely painful, for one thing. You're just not moving, makes your muscles ache. There's a terrible feeling of degradation and helplessness and pain, and you don't know when it's going to end, and you don't know what to do to get out, and it goes on, and it's just very traumatic.
So explain how you were having a breakdown, and I think a professor drove you to the hospital, right?
Correct, yeah.
And so talk about how you got there. And
this was not my first time in a hospital. I've been hospitalized in England, but England is very much more humane in a lot of ways than we are, and they haven't used full mechanical restraints for over 200 years. Anyway, my professor brought me to the ER. I had made a belt out of television wire that I found on the roof, and I was doing like that, and the very nice kind of guard type guy said, "Can I have that? I need to have that." And I said, He said, "Please, I need it." I said, "Okay, here it is, but I'm not going to give you my 6-inch nail in my pocket." And then the psychiatrist came, and he said, "I'd like the nail." And I said, "No." And he called security over and then motioned to the bed. And several people surrounded me, lifted me up, slammed me down on the bed, and tied my wrists and my ankles to the bed, and then put a net over me so I couldn't move my body either. And it was devastating. It was terrifying. I didn't know that this kind of thing existed because I hadn't seen it in England. I never read about it. I never saw it. And again, it's very painful, very degrading.
People actually die.
Actually, there was a series of articles in the Hartford Courant where they reported on some deaths, and the Harvard statistician estimated that every week in this country, 1 to 3 people die in restraints. So the question is, are we saving more people or losing more people by using restraints?
How do they actually die?
Sometimes they aspirate their vomit, or they have a heart attack, or they strangle themselves struggling. There are all sorts of different ways, but it's a terrible thing. And there's efforts underway to reduce the use of restraints. They've done it in Pennsylvania, they've done it in Massachusetts. In fact, I have a new institute called the Saks Institute for Mental Health Law Policy and Ethics here at USC, and last year our subject was mechanical restraints. So we had a distinguished lecture event, and we had a symposium, and I have students, and we're trying to get everything published. And it was very interesting to read kind of the current state of the art, which is efforts to reduce, but not everywhere.
And you were restrained for the better part of 3 weeks, right?
Well, no. The most I was restrained was 20 hours at a shot, but several times over a 3-week period, every day from 2 to 18 hours for 3 weeks. Then I went to another hospital. My behavior didn't change, and I stopped being restrained.
And how were you behaving?
I might pace anxiously or agitatedly. I might say a veiled threat, like, "Just now I thought about hurting you." I wouldn't say "I'm going to hurt you" or "I plan to hurt you," but I thought about it. In psychoanalysis, you say those kinds of things out loud, but in hospitals, you shouldn't.
Yeah. So you were in the hospital for how long?
Well, in England, the first year was a month, the second year was 4 months, and then in America it was 5 months. And it's been since 82, 83, which is, in a way, my most proud accomplishment, to have stayed out of the hospital all those years.
So after you got out of the hospital in New Haven, you were able, after I guess a year, to continue your studies at Yale?
There's actually a very funny story about that. So Yale had a policy that the director of university psychiatry should examine you, evaluate you, to see if you were ready to go back.
Yeah.
And like any good student, I looked him up. And this is before the internet, so I was pulling books from the shelves, and there was an article that he had written. Students who are withdrawn from school for psychiatric reasons, questions you want to ask and answers you want to hear. So when I went into the interview, I knew all the questions.
Oh, okay. You had cheated.
I cheated. I was like any good student, right?
So what kinds of questions were they asking?
I don't remember, to tell you the truth. I do remember that the doctor suggested that I take a year and work as a cashier somewhere. And I said I would think about it, and of course what I really thought was, I've been a student all my life, I like it, I'm good at it, your time is flexible. That would be so much less stressful for me than a line of people demanding change.
Right.
So it's not like one size fits all.
One of the, interestingly enough, after you came back to Yale, you published a paper in the Yale Law Journal.
On restraints.
On the use of mechanical restraints. In fact, that was the name of the paper, was the use of mechanical restraints in psychiatric hospitals.
Right.
Now, you, in that paper, gave no hint of what you had gone through.
Actually, the little vignette at the beginning is about me. So,
but it wasn't revealed.
It wasn't revealed.
About you.
No, it wasn't.
Oh, okay.
In fact, there's another story about that that's really telling. So I went to one of my professors who had a training in psychiatry and told him I was working on mechanical restraints, and it must be so painful and degrading. And he said, Elyn, you don't understand, these people are psychotic. They don't respond to this as you or I would. They're different.
Yeah.
I didn't have the courage at that moment to say, well, no, they're not that different from me.
Have you talked to him since?
He's passed away, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would have if.
Well, you proposed a model statute in that paper, correct?
I did.
And that was back in 1986.
Correct.
So I'm wondering, so many years later, are mental institutions more judicious now about
I think they are.
Immobilizing, strapping people down?
A lot of places are, and as I say, a number of jurisdictions have made really concerted efforts to reduce restraints, and it turns out that they can, and it doesn't cost much more, and it doesn't raise the rate of injuries, and it's just so much the right thing to do.
In fact, the recommendations that you proposed in that paper, have many of them been adopted?
Some of them have. I mentioned that I think if choices are equal, patients should be given a choice, and some of the new statutes incorporate that. I also suggested the liability regime change, and as far as I know, that hasn't happened.
Reading about how you were restrained it reminded me of something that happened to my own father.
Oh.
He went into the hospital. He was, I think, around 55 years old, around my age.
Not that old, my age too.
With chest pains. And they hooked him up, and they told him he was having a heart attack. And his first reaction was a curious one. I believe he said bullshit, and then he started to get up and leave, or tried to leave, and he didn't get it very far because they physically restrained him.
Wow. Did they then tie him to the bed?
Well, I don't know if they tied him to the bed, but they made sure he wasn't going anywhere. And so, of course, that's nothing like what you went through, but I think it kind of underscores the point that there are those situations when it makes moral, if not legal sense, to ignore what a patient wants.
Says they want,
and you don't disagree with that, do you?
No, I don't. I'm not. I think there are limited occasions where coercion makes sense, either if someone's imminently dangerous, or if they don't understand what's going on, if they lack capacity.
I mean, the deeper question here, it seems to me, is that do the mentally ill have a right to choose what kind of people they want to be, even if their families and friends and doctors feel that that choice is being heavily influenced by the disease that they're the illness that they're suffering from.
So you can almost think of it as different selves. There's a healthy self and there's the ill self. And what gives us the authority to respect the healthy self and not respect the ill self? self. Because the ill self has its own ideals and goals.
And people with schizophrenia, for example, they do often exhibit an attachment to their delusional selves, right?
Right.
So, and as you point out in your book, doctors and lawyers tend to approach that question very differently.
Totally,
right?
Yeah. Psychiatrists think of it as an illness that requires medication and therapy, and then you'll be restored to the real you, whereas lawyers are more
libertarian.
More wanting to leave it up to the person, him or herself, what they value and what they want. And if it's unwise in their point of view and the lawyer's point of view, well, that's too bad because they have their own perspective.
You note that as a group, the mentally ill are no more dangerous than people in the general population. Was there ever a point in your illness that you felt that you were dangerous?
I would say one thing first, which is that people think mentally ill people are dangerous, and some are, but the people who are really dangerous are substance abusers. They're the ones who commit most of the crimes. But I think people are more frightened of mental illness. They sort of understand drinking too much or whatever, so that mentally
it's less exotic, I
guess.
Yeah. So, did you feel at any point that you were dangerous?
Yeah, I think I was. I think when I was in Oxford and not on medication, I was had very violent thoughts and fantasies, and even carried a box cutter and a serrated kitchen knife in my purse to my sessions with my analyst. And, and she
this
knew
is
that.
The analyst that you refer to as Mrs. Jones.
Mrs. Jones, yeah.
And in your memoir, you describe how you would stop. First of all, you were very attached to this woman.
Very attached.
But at the same time, at one point, you felt that she was intended to hurt you.
Right.
And so you found yourself walking by kitchen stores, staring at knives.
Right.
And at one point,
axes.
you went into a hardware store looking for an axe.
Right.
So let's just suppose, God forbid, that you bought an axe and ended up doing something really bad with it.
Yeah.
If you were in the United States, under our laws, is it more than likely that you would have been found not guilty by reason of insanity?
Yeah, because I had a lot of delusions about Mrs. Jones and about my safety and her safety, and I think there's a good chance that I would have been found criminally insane.
Even though, the insanity defense in this country is rarely used.
Extremely rarely.
And it's even more rarely used successfully, right?
And more rarely used successfully in a contested case. Some of the cases are by agreement with the prosecution. Yeah, no, the stats are very different from what the public imagines. It's very little used and even less often successful.
I was once told by a psychiatrist that the actual wording of the delusion can have an impact on whether or not someone is judged not guilty by reason of insanity.
Yeah, so as an example, the question is, if the delusion that you had were true, would it justify what you did? So imagine someone has a delusion that his next door neighbor's spreading rumors about him and kills him, versus his next door neighbor just pulled a gun on him and was about to shoot him. So the second would be a delusion that would qualify for the insanity defense, but the first wouldn't. And you can kind of understand why, because even if it were true, it wouldn't excuse what the person did. That said, when someone's mentally ill, they're confused and they're thinking quite a bit, and it's sort of hard to pin down exactly what they're thinking and fearing and so on. But to the extent you can, the question is, would the delusion excuse you if it were
one
true?
delusion says, this guy's trying to kill me, that would be a good delusion to have if you want to get a not guilty by reason of insanity finding. But let's say your delusion is saying, your inner voices are saying to you, this person is evil and deserves to die. How would that sort of delusion work as an insanity, as part of an insanity defense?
It's difficult to say. It could go either way, that kind of delusion, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that the actual wording of a delusion can make all the difference in the world where you end up.
There's also, command hallucinations. If you think that you're being commanded by God to kill someone, that's usually a defense as well. Because you're not doing anything wrong in your own eyes, just as you're not doing anything wrong if you think someone's trying to kill you and you defend yourself, so to speak.
Most states in this country have a McNaughton type rule on the insanity defense. It's a cognitive test, whether you know the difference between right and wrong. I think it's very few states that have a volitional component to their insanity
I don't remember
defense.
what the breakdown is between those that have and don't have it. But yeah, there's the cognitive insanity defense.
I think here in California, for example, there's no irresistible impulse component.
There's not.
Do you think there should be?
Yeah, I do. I think it's troublesome because it's hard to tell when an impulse was irresistible versus
One
not
that's
resisted.
simply not resisted. Yeah.
But I think there are times when people feel impelled to do stuff and can't control themselves, and that should be, to the extent we believe it, the basis for a defense.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Jared Lee Loughner case.
Right.
Loughner, of course, was the very disturbed young man who went on a shooting spree in Arizona last January, killed 6 people and wounded 13, including Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. Soon after Loughner's arrest, the lawyers started fighting over whether or not to allow prison officials to forcibly medicate Loughner. Mm-hmm. In the end, the judge ruled that he could be forcibly medicated. Do you think the judge made the right decision?
I don't know enough about the facts. Typically you would allow medication if someone's dangerous or gravely disabled in the prison system. That's Washington versus Harper allows that for prisoners. It's a more controversial question when and whether you should be able to medicate someone to render him competent to stand trial.
Yeah, or competent to be severely punished.
Right.
Or executed.
Right. There is a competence requirement for execution. So if you don't appreciate that you're about to be killed for something that you did, you can be spared execution until you're restored to your understanding.
Right.
Some people think that's kind of crazy, because what are you going to make someone better and really appreciate how horrible it is to die and then kill them? Isn't it more humane to live? I don't think so, actually. I think that being put to death while you're insane is kind of cruel.
More cruel than being made,
I think so,
to be forcibly treated.
Right.
To be competent enough to appreciate what's happening to you.
Yeah, I really don't have an opinion on that medication issue. I'd really have to think
leave
about
mental
that
health aside. You know, there are people who become seriously ill on death row, and then the doctors come in and take heroic measures to make these people well again, so that they can execute them later.
Well, there are even worse things than that. Like someone attempts suicide the day before their execution, and they're revived and.
That's not allowed. You can't commit suicide.
No, they revive you and then kill you the next day.
Right. Well, and I guess that underscores how ritualistic it all is.
Right.
But the idea of treating people, forcing treatment on someone for the sole purpose of making that person competent enough to be seriously punished, you don't have a problem with that?
It's an issue that I need to think about more. I think it's a difficult question.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think in the execution context, first of all, there are terrible dilemmas for the psychiatrists, trying to give someone drugs to make them well so they can be killed. That just really seems to stress kind of professional psychiatric ethics.
Mm-hmm.
I basically think that people with serious mental illness shouldn't be executed anyway. They shouldn't be death penalty eligible. We've now said that you can't execute people with mental retardation and people under the age of 18 when they commit their crime. I think people with serious mental illness, even if they don't meet the insanity defense, can be so confused and deranged and unclear thinking that they should, not be death penalty eligible either.
Mm-hmm. 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 Let's talk a little bit about multiple personality disorder.
Oh, right.
You wrote a book about that called Jekyll on Trial back in, I guess it was published in 1997.
Correct. With my friend Steve Benke.
Right.
Yeah.
And first of all, just to be clear, schizophrenia is not the same as a multiple personality disorder.
Some people think it is.
Yeah.
Schizophrenia is split personality or multiple personality, but it's actually a totally different category of illness. Multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder, is a dissociative disorder. And schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder. They're just two completely different kettles of fish.
Right.
Schizophrenia involves being out of touch with reality. Multiple personality involves having splits in your mind.
There has been, and I guess there continues to be,
controversy.
A rather heated debate over whether multiple personality disorder is a real medical condition, right? But whether or not it is real, I have the sense that the the MPD, multiple personality disorder epidemic,
Right.
that we saw in the 80s and
Right.
90s, when tens of thousands of
Right.
people were told by their therapists that they
Right.
were suffering from that illness,
Right.
that is now viewed as something of an embarrassment, if not, just a full-blown scandal by the mental health establishment that, in part, staked its credibility on the authenticity of that epidemic. Do you agree with?
Oh, I think that probably in some ways, for a time, MPD or DID was overdiagnosed, or actually even created in patients, quote, iatrogenically.
Yeah, iatrogenically means created by their
doctor.
therapist.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that happened. At the same time, I think there are some real cases, and it's a mistake to say because there was overdiagnosis it doesn't exist. And I was pretty much persuaded. I watched about 100 hours of videotapes of people being interviewed on a diagnostic instrument. And I was very persuaded by some of the reality. Like one guy was saying, my boyfriend says that I get up in the middle of the night and I say I call myself by a different name and I act really scary. And he said, and my boyfriend taped me doing that the other night, but he must have drugged me because I would never have acted that way. Or there was a woman who said, I'm a therapist, I have an active practice and I'm fairly happy. And she said, and some people say I have multiple personality disorder, which is just totally insane. And then she flips. That jerk doesn't even know that I exist. So seeing things that were pretty persuasive to me. Again, acknowledging that there has been some overdiagnosis.
I
have a funny story.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things I did when I wrote my book is I wanted to get familiar with what the disorder looked like. So as I said,
how'd you get interested?
I was walking to lunch one day, my first year here at USC, and one of my colleagues saw a newspaper article about Ross Carlson, who had killed his parents, and I just thought, this is interesting. This intersects kind of psychology, philosophy, law. So I just started reading about it.
This guy had multiple personality disorder?
Yeah. He killed his school teacher parents, and in the end he ended up dying of leukemia.
Okay.
It's kind of a sad story.
Yeah.
But so as I was saying, I watched the videotapes of the patients, and there was a ward in LA at I forget the name of the hospital, but they had a ward for people with dissociation. So I went once a week for 6 months and spent a few hours with the patients. The first patient I interviewed individually, lovely person, very sweet, very committed to treatment. She's not someone who was getting a lot of secondary gain about being in the hospital. And she reported that she had, in the last couple of months gotten married, and she's in her mid-20s. That's terrific. Congratulations. She said, yes, our anniversary, our engagement lasted for 2 years because my husband insisted on getting consent of all of the alters before he would marry me. I thought that was a touching and lovely story.
I'll show you how my mind works. Does that mean, when this gentleman wants to have sex with this woman, he's got to, it's hard enough with one, many times. Yeah.
There was actually a criminal case. There was a criminal case where a guy meets a woman at a party, and she reveals that she has multiple personality disorder and that her mischievous, fun-loving personality is named Jennifer, and he calls on her at her house the next night. And she's in the car with him, and he parked, and he says, can I make love to Jennifer? Oh, is Jennifer there? Can I make love to Jennifer? So they had sex under the watchful eye of a little child named Sarah, who reported it to the police.
I know this
It's guy, Wisconsin.
Peterson was the defendant's name.
I don't remember the name.
Yeah. And this woman had like 47 personalities.
Okay.
At least it was claimed that she did. And so what do you make of that case?
It's a difficult case because, as you say, what is it for someone with multiple personality to have capacity to consent to sex, right?
Right.
Do you have to have everybody agree?
Right.
Is it enough that one competent person agrees? If that competent person is sort of the fun-loving one, well, people trade on people's vulnerabilities all the time, or whatever. So, but I do think that taking advantage of someone to be unwell is kind of unfortunate at the best.
So then, as a general rule, can people with this disorder consent to something like marriage or sex, or sign a contract?
So in my book, I talk about the civil context a little bit, and I think it's complicated. Part of me feels like in the context of, say, accepting medication, if one competent alter says yes, that's enough. part of me feels like, what if that competent alter is Jehovah's Witnesses and saying no to blood transfusion, and everybody else wants to live? So just having a competent alter maybe not enough in some contexts. So maybe you want to have an unconscionability rule. I mean, it's a difficult issue. I don't really know what the answer is.
Right. Paul McHugh, the director of
Right.
psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, I guess more or less a critic of MPD. He said, when we all look back on the MPD epidemic in this country, we will be dumbfounded by the gullibility of the public in the late 20th century and by the power of psychiatric assertions to dissolve common sense. You don't agree?
I don't agree.
Uh-huh. But aren't there those situations where an illness can kind of become an epidemic through, I don't know, it's kind of like almost becomes it's like a social contagion. And an example of that, like the 19th century, there was something called mad traveler's disease.
I never heard of that.
This is where, one guy walked off in a fugue state
right.
and ended up somewhere else and supposedly didn't have any memory of his former life. And it triggered this epidemic where everyone started walking away from their lives.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, there are contagion effects. I mean, things like self-mutilation, are more common now, probably because there's a lot of publicity, or eating disorders or whatever. There are kind of waves of, and sort of raises interesting questions about the nature of mental illness, if it can be created in that way, and that kind of thing.
I mean, it's been observed that every culture has its idiom of distress.
Right. So hysteria, Freud's day, it's very uncommon today, but borderline personality disorder is very common today, but that's, relatively new diagnosis in the last, 50 years or something like that. So that there are diagnostic trends, and kids with bipolar illness, some people think it doesn't exist. I am actually working on a book with a bipolar lawyer who wrote a book about her childhood bipolar. And she made her first suicide attempt when she was 5 or 6. I think there are some who are genuinely, but maybe it's being overdiagnosed now or whatever.
So in your book about multiple personality disorder, you allude to cases in which accused murderers or rapists with MPD claim that only 1 or 2 of their many personalities have any knowledge of or any involvement in the crimes that they've been accused of. And your position, as I understand it, is that if the MPD is real, then these defendants should never be made to go to prison.
Unless all or virtually all of their alters knew about it and acquiesced in the crime. And for me, that would be either they participated or they could have stopped it and they didn't, which is different for different people. And the funny thing is, when I first proposed this, I thought, most people with MPD would be exonerated. But then I realized that many of the cases, all the personalities took part. So most people with multiple personality who commit crimes are men, just as most people who commit crimes are men. Men with MPD have many fewer alters than, on average, than women with MPD. And a lot of times they participate. So an example is a case, I forget her name, but she had, her name was Marie Moore. She had a Marie Moore personality and a Billy Joel personality. I don't know where that came from, but and she and Billy Joel held hostage and ended up participating in the beating death of a kid, and they held hostage of several kids and then killed one of them. But both Marie Moore and Billy Joel knew about the crime. Marie Moore would pretend to be getting phone calls from Billy Joel saying what their daily discipline would be. And when the police were suspicious, Ms. Moore deflected their inquiries. So she participated in the crime. She was an accomplice. So you've got 2 personalities both participating. I think that person should be found guilty. She probably, has some mitigation available, but it shouldn't be an insanity defense based on her multiple personality disorder. And a lot of times, the criminal defendants, all the alters do participate.
Okay, so say if all the personalities are participating in a crime, the person is convicted, and say after the conviction, another personality pops up.
Yeah, that's a good question.
What do you do then?
I mean, I think this is one of those line drawing things again. I think you just say, sorry, you're in. You were responsible. It's
Really?
hard.
I mean,
Yeah, I don't
that
know. It is
compromise,
hard.
because you analogize this to conjoined twins.
Right.
You know, if one of your twins shoots somebody.
Right. See, the thing that I'm concerned about is just too much the possibility of malingering, just fabricating this personality, which is also true at the front end.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you draw the line?
Yeah. You got me up against a wall.
Well, what about?
Well, then the other issue is if it's not fair to put them all in prison, if not all of them are guilty, is it fair to put them all in a hospital if not all of them have mental illness?
Right.
And not all of them are dangerous. And
Right.
that's a good question.
Well, I guess the answer would have something to do with the hospital being a place for treatment and the prison being a place for punishment.
Right.
So I think it's fairer to put the innocent personalities in a treatment facility than to put them in a punitive environment.
Exactly.
So what happens when that innocent personality pops up after the crime has been committed?
And we believe it's genuine.
Yeah, let's say we believe it's genuine.
I think
we still have you?
You still have me. You still have me.
Do multiple personalities need multiple lawyers?
Yeah, and what is it for them to be competent to stand trial?
And does each one have, and if one lawyer is more expensive than the other, I mean, how's that get all sorted out?
There was actually, when I was working on multiple personality disorder, there was an article in a local Beverly Hills newspaper that I ran across in which a French lawyer was suing his other personalities for using his money, using up his money.
How did that work?
I never heard what the outcome was. But.
Do you have any idea how many criminal defendants have invoked MPD as a defense?
Oh, a pretty small number. I don't know the exact number, but it's a hard case to win because most people are skeptical.
Right. So, I mean, would it surprise you if like more than a dozen have mounted defense and were successful with it?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I would be surprised if more than 2 or 3 were successful.
Really?
But in terms of invoking it, 10, 20, something like that.
Yeah.
Not a large number.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you, reading your book about multiple personality disorder, a couple things occurred to me. Number one, it's hard not to be overwhelmed by a sense of the bizarreness of it.
Yeah.
And the second thing that occurred to me was that, when you look at our criminal justice system, it subscribes to very conventional notions of responsibility and free will.
Right,
So how does that system get its arms around what you're talking about?
Well, it's the reason the insanity defense is so often invoked, and because it's so often unsuccessful and sometimes can backfire. I think the disorder itself is more understandable. I mean, it's sort of got this exotic, kind of florid kind of quality to it. But the basic mechanism is, a little kid is being hurt by someone she loves, and she makes it happen to her and not to me. She splits away, it's happening to her and not to me. And it's a very common response to trauma dissociation. So like a lot of rape victims report that they went up to the ceiling and were looking down on themselves being raped. That's another form of dissociation. Mm-hmm. It's a very common response to trauma. With a little kid, when it happens when you're really young and haven't had time to consolidate a personality, you can have the splintering that looks like multiple personality disorder.
It seems to me whether or not MPD is real, your discussion of it, I think, does raise broader questions. For example, let's say someone commits a very serious crime and ends up getting a life sentence. And then, say, 5 or 6 years into the sentence, this person has shows a dramatic transformation, say a born-again kind of conversion. Right. It seems to me, under your logic that you apply to MPD cases, wouldn't we have to discontinue the punishment of this person?
Because it's a different person.
Yeah, because in a more than trivial sense, the person that committed the crime no longer exists.
Right. No, I think that's a very good point. And I think, I guess I think in the same way that if someone develops MPD once they've been convicted, they should stay in prison, that if someone gets better. 2 things. The difference between the born-again person and his past person is probably less significant than the difference between alters. They have memories of each other, and they consider each other the same person and that kind of thing. Whereas MPD, there are these like amnesia barriers cordoning off some of the personalities, and they don't feel like one person and that kind of thing. So they identify as different selves and not just parts of a different self or a person who's been transformed. So I think the way we would talk about the person who's been transformed is a person who's been transformed, not a new person. Whereas with MPD, there's a stronger case for saying they really are different personalities or people.
But isn't there with many of these people a host that sort of underlies all the personalities?
Well, there's a host. All that really means is there's a personality that's in charge. Whatever personality is in charge most of the time is called the host, and it can vary from time to time, and it can last longer or shorter periods of time, and that kind of thing. So, I mean, when I first started working on this, I thought one of the things I thought was, maybe the rule should be only if the host commits the crime is the person guilty, because the host is the person. And in fact, there's a case like that called Denny Schaffer,
right.
Where the court says unless the host commits the crime, the person's not guilty by reason of insanity.
And you thought that was a meaningless distinction?
I think the host concept is not that robust of a concept. It's kind of just practical way of thinking about the person. So whatever personality is in control most of the time, it can vary from time to time. They can be in existence for shorter or longer lengths of time, and so on. But basically, the thing that moved me was that all person-like alters, there are transient personalities and there are fragments, but all person-like alters have as much claim to be the person as the host personality. They're really the same concept.
I asked you before whether, the person that, undergoes that born-again conversion,
right.
You're saying that there's enough integration there that it's still one person.
Right.
And so you would make...
But actually, I'm fairly tempted if someone really undergoes a radical personality transformation and so on, that maybe they should have some, lenience or mercy or whatever.
What about like a juvenile that gets a life sentence?
Right.
There's, I think, an argument to be made that, people who are locked up as teenagers, as much older people, are different people.
Yeah. It's all, well, I don't know if I would call them different people, but it's certainly the case that people who are young have less capacity and less ability to control themselves and less ability to understand the implications of their behavior than people who are older. And I think that's why we have the juvenile justice system and don't penalize juveniles as much. And as I said, again, we don't execute people who commit their crime before the age of 18. But you're right. If someone commits I know. Someone commits a crime, when they're 17, that's really horrific. Again, we have the opportunity of treating them as adult and keeping them in, but it's a harder choice than someone who's older and does the same thing.
Yeah. Well, reading that book on MPD that you wrote, it just reminded me how, squishy these notions like personal identity and personality can become the more and more you look at it.
Yeah.
I mean, you very spontaneously had a existential meltdown at the age of 7.
Right.
But then there are these sophisticated philosophers who, think about, like Derek Parfit, who think about personality and identity, and they kind of, it seems to me, arrive at that same sense of
that's so interesting.
Of incoherence on these topics.
Interesting. It's sort of, when I think, I've actually had a colleague who was visiting here who's both a philosopher and a lawyer, as a law professor, and we were kind of noting that a lot of the things philosophers believe or play with are things that mentally ill people really believe.
Yeah.
So philosophers, say you can't prove the existence of the external world, but no philosopher lives as if there is no external world. Well, some mental patients do. They have a psychotic belief that the world has come to an end, and they don't interact with the world. So on the one hand, it's kind of an interesting and, challenging kind of philosophical problem. On the other hand, actually lived, it's a severe life problem.
Didn't Wittgenstein see a very close connection between mental illness and philosophy?
Did he? I'm not aware of his work on that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't surprise me. And then I wrote a paper about the Schreber case. Schreber was a German judge who had a breakdown, and he wrote his memoir, and Freud wrote a case study.
Yeah.
And
Daniel Paul
Schreber.
Yeah.
Wow. Good memory. And And I wrote a paper about Schreiber as well. What were we talking about?
Well,
oh yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah. So the thing is that he, he wrote this really wacky memoir.
Yes.
He was being transformed by the rays of God. I read the memoir. Yeah. Transformed by the rays of God to become a woman and bring forth a new race of man and woman. Yeah. Which, by the way, when I was on the teaching market and speaking to Notre Dame and they asked me about this paper, I said that, and one of the persons, a nun, said, "What's wrong with that?" But so his memoir is totally wacky. It's way off the wall, right. Even though it's sort of like a lot of the old philosophers' cosmologies, except it was very self-referential, but it was in the same kind of vein. And then at the end, he appended a legal brief to get himself out of the hospital, which was completely lucid, completely coherent. And it was just so interesting to...
When you read that memoir, did you identify...
I did.
Because a lot of the delusions, I mean, you didn't imagine yourself
being transformed
into a man, but the paradoxical quality of the delusions, vacillating between omnipotence and profound vulnerability. A lot of that is in your memoir.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really resonated with me.
Let's change the subject entirely and talk about the connection between genius and mental illness. It's long been suspected that there is a connection. And indeed, when you read the biographies of artists and novelists and scientists, I don't know if most of them, but
I wouldn't
certainly
say most, but
a healthy percentage of them, have struggled with a mental illness of one sort or another.
Well, actually, Kay Jamison, whom I've met and really think highly of, wrote a great memoir called Unquiet Mind. But her first book was called Touch with Fire, and it was about all the famous bipolar people in history who've been creative geniuses and artists and so on.
Less so with schizophrenics.
Much less so with schizophrenics. I mean, typically with schizophrenia, your first year or two with the disorder, your IQ points go down. There's no correlation between high IQ and schizophrenia. High correlation with low socioeconomic class. Could be downward drift, could be just more stressful to be poor. But people with schizophrenia typically aren't the ones, you've got your exceptions like John Nash.
Right.
Although Nash actually made his discoveries before he became ill, so I'm not really sure that his illness facilitated his discoveries. Mm-hmm. Maybe he was getting ill or whatever. Mm-hmm. There is, the kind of out-of-the-box thinking that you might get with a mental illness, and sometimes that's productive and sometimes it's damaging.
Do you feel that your illness has in any way facilitated your creativity?
I think I might have been a little bit more flexible, like with this idea that multiple personalities could be people by the best criteria of personal identity. I mean, that's sort of a very, kind of avant-garde or quirky or eccentric way to think. And I think it makes some sense, and so maybe thinking out of the box made me think of that, and I wouldn't have. For the most part, I think, my illness fights against my creativity and my productivity. And my productivity and creativity fight against my illness, because when I'm working, I can usually keep the bad stuff to the periphery. It's sort of a very therapeutic for me to use my mind, so to speak.
But when you were fighting the idea of being dependent on these antipsychotic drugs, your concern was that they undermined your authentic self.
Yeah.
And so was that tied into any sense of creativity that...
No, I know people think if I take medication, it's going to take away my creativity. I never really thought that. For me, I think the main thing was the quote, as we say in the field, narcissistic injury of having a mental illness and needing medication. And so I used to say, I don't want medication because I don't want to use a crutch. And now I say, if my foot were broken, I'd gladly use a crutch. Aren't my neurotransmitters entitled to his gentle treatment? Mm-hmm. So I've sort of gotten over the shame of having a mental illness and needing treatment. And that was a big thing in my therapy.
Can you describe to me, what it's like to live with your brain now?
Pretty much like what it's like to live with most people's brains who do kind of creative or intellectual work and have important people in their lives, and I think in many ways I'm fairly normal now, except I have these transient thoughts, and I have periods of 2 or 3 days, several times a year when I kind of fall off the cliff. But for the most part, I think I'm pretty healthy. Mm-hmm. I think I'm probably healthier than many of my neurotic colleagues,
well,
even though I have a psychosis back to the same.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Professor Saks, it was really just a treat talking to you today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Marty. I enjoyed talking to you as well. Thanks.